My lungs seized as I pushed open the dining room door. The chandelier light caught on my sister Victoria's fingers, intertwined with Daniel's, my fiancé's, hand on the table. The roast chicken I'd spent hours preparing suddenly smelled sickening. The engagement dinner I'd meticulously planned froze in a tableau of betrayal. 12 guests with forks suspended, my mother's gaze darting away from mine, my father studying his wine glass with sudden fascination. "Olivia," Daniel said, his voice gentler than it had any right to be. "Victoria and I need to be honest about something." My sister's chin lifted slightly, that familiar tilt she'd perfected since childhood. Half challenge, half triumph. The diamond ring I wore suddenly felt like it was burning into my skin. "We've fallen in love," Victoria continued, her voice steady while mine had disappeared completely. "It wasn't planned, but we can't ignore how we feel anymore." The room became unnaturally quiet. No gasps of shock, no protests, just the soft hum of the heating system and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. That's when I understood. They already knew. My parents, our friends, everyone gathered to celebrate my engagement had been expecting this performance. "My name is Olivia. I'm 32 and a marketing strategist. This is the story of how I reclaimed my dignity from the people who thought they could erase me." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. Something stone cold and clear crystallized inside me as I watched my sister's thumb brush across Daniel's knuckles. My mother's eyes pleaded silently, "Don't make a scene." My father cleared his throat, preparing to smooth over this moment like he'd smoothed over every uncomfortable truth in our family history. "Well," he finally said, "these things happen. These things happen." As if my sister stealing my fiancé at our engagement dinner was as unavoidable as rain on a picnic. As if the months I'd spent planning our future, the promises Daniel had made just that morning, were simply inconvenient details. I slipped my engagement ring off without a word. The platinum band made a small, definitive sound as I placed it beside my untouched dessert plate. Then I walked out, each click of my heels against the hardwood floor like a countdown to something no one else could hear. In the hallway, I caught my reflection in the antique mirror. Shoulders straight, expression composed, only the slight tremor in my hands betraying the earthquake happening inside me. Behind me, the murmur of conversation had already resumed, as if my exit was merely an intermission in their evening. That night, I didn't cry myself to sleep. I made lists. By morning, I had mapped out exactly how I would disappear from their narrative while writing my own. I packed a single suitcase, clothes, credentials, the business contacts I'd cultivated independently. I transferred my portion of our shared accounts to a new bank. I signed a lease on a studio apartment in the industrial district, a neighborhood my family would never visit. I didn't leave a note. I didn't answer calls. I changed my phone number and email address, severing all digital connections to my previous life. I erased myself from their world as thoroughly as they had erased me from their concern. The first year was a blur of 18-hour workdays and night classes. I said yes to every project, every challenge, every opportunity to prove my value without my family's connections. My tiny apartment above a bookstore became a war room, whiteboards covered with strategies, late nights illuminated by my laptop's glow as I taught myself skills no one expected me to master. Sometimes, in the quietest hours before dawn, Victoria's triumphant smile would flash behind my eyelids. I'd remember the way Daniel's hand had fit so naturally in hers, as if they'd been practicing. But these memories didn't weaken me. They fueled something cold and precise in my chest. Not revenge, exactly. Something cleaner. Reclamation. I moved through the marketing world like a ghost with purpose. Projects that no one wanted became my specialty. Clients others dismissed became my loyal base. I developed a reputation for turning failing campaigns into success stories, for seeing angles others missed. Each victory was another brick in the wall between my old life and my new one. It was at a charity auction, 18 months after I'd walked out of that dinner, that I first met Reed Harrison. I was representing a client. He was there as a major donor. We ended up seated at the same table, making polite conversation over mediocre salmon and excellent wine. What struck me first wasn't his appearance, though he was certainly striking. Tall, with eyes that seemed to evaluate everything without judgment. It was the quality of his attention. When I spoke about marketing strategy, he didn't nod politely or change the subject. He asked intelligent questions, challenged my assumptions, offered perspectives I hadn't considered. "You don't seem impressed by names," he observed after I diplomatically redirected a conversation about family connections. "Results impress me," I replied. "Names are just shortcuts for people who don't want to do the work." Something in his expression shifted, a recognition perhaps. By dessert, we were deep in conversation about market disruption and authentic messaging. Neither of us mentioned personal histories or families. It was the most engaged I'd felt in a conversation since before Daniel. What I didn't know then was that Reed had built his investment firm from nothing after being cut out of his own family's business. What I couldn't have guessed was that he operated in the same circles as my parents, but followed entirely different rules about loyalty, integrity, and consequences. We became colleagues first. My agency contracted with his firm for a rebranding campaign. Our meetings were strictly professional, ideas exchanged over conference tables, strategies refined over working lunches. But something was building beneath the surface, a recognition that went beyond business compatibility. 6 months into our professional relationship, he asked me to dinner, not at one of the flashy restaurants my family frequented, but at a small bistro owned by a chef who had walked away from a Michelin star to cook food that mattered to him. "I thought you might appreciate the story," Reed said as we sat down. I did. That night, we talked about everything except work. He told me about building his firm from a single desk in a shared office space, about the principles he refused to compromise even when it cost him clients. I found myself sharing things I hadn't told anyone, about the night I walked away, about the silence from people I'd thought were friends, about the determination that had replaced what I once thought was love. "They thought they were ending your story," he said quietly. "They didn't realize they were just giving you a better one to write." Months became years. Reed and I built something neither of us had been looking for, a partnership based on respect first, then trust, then a deeper emotion neither of us rushed to name. We moved carefully, both aware of old wounds, both committed to creating something authentic. By the time we married in a private ceremony 3 years after we met, I had rebuilt myself into someone my former family wouldn't recognize. My agency had tripled in size. My client roster included names that made industry veterans take notice, and Reed's firm had become known for ethical investment strategies that outperformed the market precisely because they looked beyond short-term gains. We didn't announce our marriage in the society pages. We didn't send announcements. We exchanged vows in a garden with only our closest friends present, then returned to building our shared vision. I'd almost forgotten about my former life when the cream-colored envelope arrived at my office. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately, Victoria's practiced looping script. Inside was an embossed invitation to the Whitlock Family Charity Gala, celebrating 10 years of their foundation. My first instinct was to drop it in the shredder. 5 years had passed since I'd heard their voices, 5 years in which I'd built a life so far from theirs that the invitation felt like a message from a foreign country. I wondered briefly how Victoria had found my office address after all this time, likely through the business directories where my agency was now prominently featured. But curiosity is a powerful force, not about them exactly, but about what it would feel like to walk into their world again. Not as the daughter they'd dismissed or the sister they'd betrayed, but as the woman I'd become. When I showed Reed the invitation, he listened without interrupting. Then he simply said, "If you go as yourself, not as their daughter." His tone wasn't sharp, but it was steady, the steadiness of someone who knew exactly who he was and who I was. So I planned, but not the way I once would have. I didn't call to confirm. I didn't send a note. I simply made a decision and prepared accordingly. 3 days before the event, I registered online using the code on the invitation, securing my place at the gala without direct communication. On the night of the gala, I wore black silk and a simple diamond pin Reed had given me the previous winter. Understated, but impossible to miss. My hair was swept up, my heels sharp enough to make each step sound deliberate against marble floors. The venue was exactly as I remembered: white columns, chandeliers casting prismatic light across polished surfaces, guests who measured worth in names and influence. I moved through the crowd like smoke, exchanging nods, offering small smiles. People looked at me with polite curiosity, trying to place me, but not quite able to connect the dots. I spotted her across the room, Victoria in pale gold, holding court with a circle of admirers. She was thinner than I remembered, her gestures more deliberate, her laugh a precise calibration of volume and pitch. Daniel wasn't with her, I noticed. She hadn't seen me yet. Reed arrived 20 minutes after I did, precisely as planned. We had agreed he would come separately after finalizing some last-minute foundation details. I watched him cross the marble foyer, accepting a handshake from the event director, nodding to donors whose names were engraved on the walls. He moved through spaces like this with easy confidence. Never rushed, never uncertain. Always exactly where he meant to be. When his eyes found mine across the room, the corners crinkled slightly. He didn't rush to my side. He didn't need the gesture to make a point. He simply navigated toward me with purpose, stopping briefly to exchange words with people who clearly valued his attention. We hadn't taken 2 steps together when the foundation's chair intercepted us, relief evident in his expression. "Mr. Harrison, we're finalizing the speaker sequence. The press is already gathering on the west balcony." "I'll be brief," Reed replied, his voice measured. "Tonight isn't about me." It was only a sentence, but I saw recognition ripple through nearby conversations. Heads turned subtly, then less subtly. Reed's firm had quietly become the largest anonymous donor to community development projects across the city. The press had been speculating about the source of matching funds for months. When we entered the main ballroom, the band transitioned to something softer, more refined. The ceiling was washed in warm gold light that caught on crystal and silver until the air itself seemed to shimmer. Waiters moved like a choreographed tide, bearing trays of champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres, the quiet pageantry of wealth pretending to be generosity. Victoria noticed us immediately. Her gaze landed on Reed first, then jumped to me with almost comical shock before returning to him. Confusion fractured her composed expression. I guided us toward the donor recognition wall where Reed was to sign the evening's pledge book. The coordinator handed him a pen with exaggerated reverence. Beside his signature, the program noted, "Matching endowment, anonymous benefactor, 2021 to 2025. The secret was out. The foundation chair tapped his glass for attention and took the small stage. "Friends, before we begin, a word from the man whose firm's partnership has made tonight's expansion possible. Please welcome Reed Harrison." The applause wasn't thunderous, it was respectful, balanced carefully between curiosity and recognition. Reed squeezed my hand once before releasing it and taking the stage. He didn't launch into prepared remarks. He simply stood until the room quieted around him. "I grew up watching my mother calculate grocery bills with a pencil," he said, his voice carrying without effort. "Community support kept our lights on when nothing else would. When we succeed, we have an obligation to create opportunities for others. Not charity, but genuine chances. Tonight is about the students in the back rows, not about anyone on this stage." He kept it to 90 seconds. The foundation chair looked relieved. The press looked hungry for more. When Reed returned to my side, Victoria was already moving toward us, her smile fixed, but her eyes calculating. "Mr. Harrison," she said, extending her hand as if posing for an invisible camera. "I'm Victoria Whitlock. We have mutual connections." "So I understand." Reed took her hand briefly, the minimum courtesy required. "Good to meet you." I watched the exact moment comprehension dawned. Her pupils contracted, her breath caught. "Olivia," she said, her voice shifting to a register I remembered from childhood, the one she used when trying to repair damage she'd caused. "You didn't RSVP. We weren't sure." "I wasn't asked," I replied simply. "I registered online with the invitation code 3 days ago." She laughed, a high, brittle sound that evaporated into the ambient noise. "Small world. I actually pitched a campaign to Harrison Investments 2 years ago." She turned to Reed, leaning in just enough to capture better light on her features. We didn't get it, but I've admired your work since the Durant acquisition. Reed's expression remained pleasant but unmoved. We passed on that campaign because it relied on manufactured scarcity tactics. Our foundation addresses actual scarcity: food access, housing, education. I'm sure you understand the distinction. Her smile held for one beat, then fractured. Color drained from her face in a slow tide. She wasn't just pale. She looked unmade, her carefully constructed persona suddenly transparent. Her eyes darted to the press photographers across the room, then back to Reed, then to me, searching desperately for stable ground. "Excuse me," she murmured, reaching for a champagne flute from a passing tray and missing by centimeters. The glass wobbled precariously. I steadied it with 2 fingers and returned it to the waiter's tray. Victoria swallowed visibly and tried again. "I didn't realize you two knew each other." "We're married," I said simply, feeling the truth of it settle in my chest like a perfect weight. "We have been for 2 years now." Something collapsed behind her eyes. I could see the calculations racing: the sister she'd dismissed at 27, the man she'd taken because she could, the silence she'd interpreted as defeat, and now this reality that contradicted everything she'd told herself. Reed glanced toward the student tables in the back of the room. "If you'll excuse me, I promised to meet with the robotics team." He nodded to Victoria, a courtesy, not an invitation, and gave me a look that communicated everything we didn't need to say aloud. Then he moved away, immediately engaged by a group of scholarship recipients. Victoria watched him go, her lips parting as if there might be a question there, or a plea she couldn't quite form. The band began a new arrangement. Couples shifted onto the dance floor. Around us, the gala's rhythm reasserted itself. "Was there something you wanted to ask me?" I said quietly. Her head jerked slightly. No. "That's a first," I replied, and let it be gentle rather than cutting. She attempted another smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You look different." "I am." We stood for a moment in the soft golden light of the world we'd both been raised to revere. Then a photographer called her name from across the floor. Pure reflex made her turn, chin lifting automatically to face the camera. The flash caught her before she could compose herself. Not triumphant, not gracious, just starkly revealed. I set my empty glass on a passing tray and moved toward the balcony doors where the air promised to be cooler, clearer. Victoria didn't follow. Behind me, the band shifted keys. Conversations blended into ambient sound. Ahead, the night waited, and somewhere between the two, I felt the subtle release of an old story finally concluding. Reed found me on the balcony 15 minutes later, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass that caught amber light from the ballroom behind us. He didn't speak immediately. That was one of the first things I'd noticed about him years ago. His ability to let silence exist until it had something worthwhile to fill it. "You handled that well," he said finally, his gaze on the city skyline. "I barely said anything," I replied. "That's why it worked." A server quietly placed 2 fresh glasses on a nearby table and withdrew without a word. The door closed behind him, muffling the gala's cultivated chatter. We were in our own orbit now. From inside, the pledge drive had begun. Enthusiastic voices urging donation numbers higher, the soft percussion of pens against paper, as guests signed commitments they'd largely forgotten by Monday morning. Out here, the city's rhythm was steadier, less performative. Reed turned toward me, his expression open but searching. "She didn't expect you." "She never expects consequences," I said. There was no bitterness in my voice anymore, just the weight of understanding worn smooth over time. Victoria had moved through life assuming outcomes always bent to her charm, that people simply forgot harm if she kept smiling. For years, I'd let her believe it. Tonight, I hadn't needed to correct her. Reality had done that more effectively than I ever could. "I didn't marry you to make a point," Reed said, and I believed him completely. "But I'm not sorry she saw who you've become." I met his gaze. The light caught at the edge of his profile, and for a moment the image felt like something a photographer would stage. 2 figures on a balcony, golden light behind them, city lights spread before them. But there was nothing staged about this moment. It was the simple culmination of years neither of us had to explain. Through the glass doors, I caught a glimpse of Victoria moving between tables, her smile back in place but thinner now, brittle at the edges. She laughed at something someone said, but her hand went to her glass twice in quick succession. A nervous tell I'd known since we were children. Reed followed my glance, then released it. "You don't owe her anything." I know. And I did. The part of me that had once needed her recognition or apology was gone, dissolved somewhere between the night I walked away from my broken engagement and the years I'd spent building a life beyond their expectations. The pledge drive inside reached its peak. Someone had matched a major gift. Applause rolled through the room like a polite wave. Reed set down his glass with quiet finality. "We should head back inside," he said. "The chair will send someone looking for us soon." We stayed where we were for another moment, the sounds of the city filling the space between us. Below, a couple walked hand in hand, their heads bent toward each other in a conversation the rest of the world couldn't touch. I watched them until they disappeared under the canopy of a nearby theater. When we finally stepped back into the ballroom, the event was shifting into its final phase. Tables being cleared, guests saying elaborate goodbyes, the satisfied hum of people convinced of their own generosity. Victoria was nowhere in sight. Reed's hand found the small of my back. "Ready?" "Yes," I said, and I wasn't talking about leaving the gala. Somewhere in the quiet after Victoria's facade had cracked, I'd realized this night wasn't about showing her anything. It was about closing the final door she'd left open in my life. As we moved toward the exit, the golden light followed us to the threshold. Then the doors closed behind us, and we stepped out into the cool night. No applause, no cameras, just the clean, certain air of something completed. We didn't speak of Victoria on the drive home. The city lights slid past the windows, soft blurs against darkness. Reed's hand rested over mine, steady and warm. In the quiet, I thought about the years between losing Daniel and finding Reed, the long, disciplined work of learning to live without proving anything to anyone. I'd built something unassailable in that time, brick by careful brick, so that even tonight's confrontation was merely a ripple, not a storm. By the time we reached our street, I understood the true resolution wasn't the moment Victoria paled or the flash that captured her unprepared. It was this: the simple fact that I no longer needed any of it to happen. The past had already occurred. The future belonged entirely to us. I walked into our home, closed the door, and didn't look back. I later learned through industry circles that Daniel and Victoria's relationship had ended less than a year after that engagement dinner. He'd moved to the West Coast while she remained firmly entrenched in our family's social sphere. The engagement ring he'd once given me had been replaced by 3 others in quick succession, none resulting in marriage. According to mutual contacts in the industry, their breakup had been as dramatic and public as their beginning. Some patterns, it seems, repeat themselves without resolution. As for me, I found that true reclamation wasn't about revenge or even confrontation. It was about building something so authentic that the past became merely prologue, not definition.